It was her birthday. Carmen Bellamy, my wife, my partner, my storm, turned 34. Surrounded by champagne flutes, curated flowers, and the kind of opulence that made the air feel thinner. We were at La Fontaine, a 5-star rooftop restaurant that overlooked the city she claimed as her own. Her father owned the building. Her mother selected the guest list. Her friends, socialites, and designer gowns and overpriced heels floated around her like satellites orbiting a sun made of sharp smiles and calculated stares. I stood at the edge of the gathering, watching. My suit felt tighter than usual, not in size, but in tension. 8 years. That's how long I'd stood beside her, building her name into something people whispered with awe and envy. 8 years of stepping back while she stepped forward, of nodding through dinners where I didn't belong, and clapping through award speeches that never once mentioned me. I wasn't bitter. I was just tired of pretending I didn't notice. Then she raised her glass. The music dipped, forks clinked gently against crystal. She wore a white silk dress, her skin glowing under the chandeliers, her smile touched with something venomous. "Thank you all for coming," she began, voice smooth and camera ready. "It means the world to celebrate with my favorite people, my friends, my family." Her gaze found me for the briefest flicker, and of course, my soon-to-be ex-husband. A ripple of laughter ran through the room. I didn't laugh. Some of them did nervous performative chuckles. But a few, they roared. Gia, her best friend and loyal leech, even clapped like it was the punchline to a brilliant stand-up set. Carmen sipped her champagne slowly, savoring the stunned silence that followed. It hit me like a slap made of velvet. Not the words. We'd been cold for months, distant for longer. But the way she delivered them, like it was a victory. Like I was just one more task checked off her to-do list. Carmen always knew how to wound with precision. But tonight, she wanted to draw blood in front of an audience. So I smiled. And that's when I reached into my inner jacket pocket and pulled out the envelope. White, sealed, thicker than it should have been for a birthday card. Carmen's eyes narrowed the way they did when she sensed something slipping out of her control. I walked up to her, every step calm, deliberate. She didn't flinch, didn't step back. Of course she didn't. She thought she'd already won. "Happy birthday," I said, voice even. She took the envelope, still playing the crowd, smirk half-cocked. "Oh, a goodbye letter." "Something like that," I replied and turned to the guests. "I suggest you all stay near your phones. There's going to be a lot of missed calls in the next few minutes." Laughter died in their throats. The DJ froze with his hand mid-slide. Somewhere near the back, I saw Carmen's cousin whispering to someone from Forbes. Even they sensed it. The tension. The shift. Carmen opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Legal formatting. Headers bolded. Her eyes scanned the contents once, then again. Slower. The smirk cracked. "Then I suggest you explain to your parents," I said, voice rising just enough to carry their house, and all their cars will be repossessed in exactly 9 minutes. Silence. "And why your company Nova will be bankrupt in exactly 1 hour. I let the words sit there. She didn't respond. Couldn't because she was too busy reading the fine print. The one where Spectre Holdings, my shell company, called in the debt co-signed by her father 2 years ago. The one that used Bellamy property as collateral. The one that legally allowed us to fund their expansion while keeping me invisible in the paperwork. Except I wasn't invisible. Not really. Carmen's fingers trembled slightly, barely noticeable to anyone else. But I saw it because I knew her. I knew what it meant when her nails tapped 3 times against her thigh. It meant panic. It meant she wasn't in control. I turned without another word. Behind me, the chatter was gone. The air had gone thin again. Not because of wealth, but because of fear. I walked through the dining area, past the bar, down the marbled steps. The valet raised an eyebrow as I tossed him the ticket. I didn't speak. My silence was louder than anything I could have shouted. When the car arrived, I got in and rolled the windows down. I could still hear something from upstairs. Maybe a scream, maybe a phone dropping. I didn't care. I checked my watch. 7 minutes and 42 seconds. Enough time for the truth to finish lighting its fuse. For 8 years, I've been the man behind the screen. The coder, the architect, the ignored. But tonight, I was the reckoning. I looked back once, just once. La Fontaine glowed like a jewel in the night sky. The kind of place where people wore masks they mistook for personality. Carmen was still up there clutching champagne in her own hubris, trying to spin a narrative she could no longer control. Maybe she was already calling Braden, her junior CTO. Maybe she was yelling at her father. Maybe she was finally realizing that while she played queen, I built the castle and I knew every brick. As the light turned green, I smiled. Let them burn. I didn't start the fire. I just stopped putting it out. Tonight wasn't the collapse. It was the toast that burned. And I was finally warm again. Let's rewind to the beginning of the end. Carmen Bellamy wasn't always the cold sociopath everyone assumed at that rooftop spectacle. Once upon a time, she had warmth in her eyes and dreams lined up the way people line up hopes at a charity gala. But even then, from the moment she and I met, I wasn't her equal. I was the boring tech guy, the man behind the code, while she dazzled investors in ballrooms and posed for glossy magazine covers when Nova Technologies was just an idea scribbled on a napkin in a coffee shop. She was the spark. Charismatic, fearless, relentless. But every flame needs oxygen, and I provided that oxygen. I wrote the code that made Nova function. I architected the systems that scaled it. I whispered solutions into late-night conference calls while she polished her image on morning talk shows. Back then, our apartment was 2 small rooms and a kitchenette so cramped the coffee table doubled as my hardware lab. Our fridge blinked low, not for low battery, but low food because all our capital went into servers. Carmen never complained. She was too busy charming venture capitalists, turning beta into billion-dollar valuation before the rest of us could spell algorithm. I was proud of her success, proud that I had a hand in building something that made people stand up and take notice. I coded features that predicted user behavior, stored terabytes of data without a hitch, and integrated AI-driven analytics when the market was still snickering at machine learning. Every time Nova grew, I watched quietly as her bank account swelled, knowing full well that the legal filings, the name on every patent, every share of stock, all bore her name, not mine. As Nova's public face rose, our marriage crept into the shadows. Separate bank accounts, separate bedrooms, separate calendars. I knew what that meant. She wanted freedom, the freedom to call late-night board meetings without worrying about my feelings, to accept gifts from sponsors without me questioning their motives, to flirt with fame in a way she couldn't if there were whispers of a tech geek at her side. And so I stayed silent because tech geeks don't make headlines. They make systems, and those systems made her a queen. But I saw the warning signs. Phone calls she took in the bathroom, strange laughter drifting from her office, lawyers who showed up just to review contracts that never included me. I noticed the trainer Levi she hired under the guise of wellness coaching, who spent more time commenting on the way I dressed than the angles of her posture. I noticed the junior CTO Braden being ushered into confidential meetings that once belonged to me. And yet, I stayed quiet because in every whispered conversation about vision and leadership, I heard the faint echo of my own name bleeding out of the company we built together. 6 months ago, I began to prepare. Not for revenge, at least, not at first. I simply needed options. I formed Spectre Holdings, a shell company with no traceable ties to me on paper. I funneled small sums into it legally through private equity funds no one bothered to scrutinize. Then, in the dead of night, I registered every line of code I had ever written, every software arch, every byte of data flow, not under Carmen Bellamy's name, but under Spectre's. I embedded a hidden protocol in Nova Score system, a lockout only reversible by my biometric key. I mirrored backups in offshore servers. I drafted promissory notes co-signed by her father for expansion loans, loans she believed were another family investment. All that remained was the trigger. I wasn't a bitter spouse seeking petty payback. I was a strategist building an exit of last resort. As the months passed, I grew distant. Gone from board meetings, absent from dinners with her parents, silent in our bedroom when she tried to discuss IPO projections at midnight. I became a ghost in my own home. She noticed, of course, but chalked it up to stress. A tech founder's life is demanding. She never suspected that behind my quietude lay a meticulous plan. When the moment came, I wasn't shaking or hesitant. I was calm, eerily calm. When she toasted me at her birthday party, I didn't see humiliation. I saw opportunity. After she spoke, after the laughter died, after the applause faded, I stood up and delivered the envelope, dressed in everything they respected. A tailored suit, a confident smile, and absolute authority. In that instant, I was no longer a footnote in her success story. I was the editor rewriting the final chapter. Now, as I sit here recounting this memory, I realize how easy it was, not because I'm cruel, but because I understood the architecture of her empire better than anyone, including her. I knew the exact moment when the servers would lock, the banks would freeze assets, and the investors would scramble to salvage what they thought was stable. She built an empire on my shoulders, an empire of shiny presentations and empty promises without recognizing the foundation was laid in code, logic, and strategy. When she called our marriage over a glass of champagne, I called her bluff with an envelope that said more than any passionate argument could. 9 minutes for collateral to change hands. 1 hour for Nova to fall silent. Her empire wasn't built on vision alone. It was built on the back of a man she believed she could discard. And in the end, she learned that power isn't measured by bank balances or board seats. Power is knowing exactly which strings to pull to collapse a castle. I pulled those strings. And now, because she ever underestimated the quiet tech guy, her world burns on her own terms. But I walk away with the ashes of her empire and the blueprint to build a new one where I'm never invisible again. I was barely out of sight when the first tremors of panic rippled through La Fontaine's grand dining room. My footsteps echoed on the marble floors as I descended the staircase. But behind me, the hiss of incoming alerts rose into a cacophony of panic. I barely stepped onto the cobblestone sidewalk when my phone buzzed, a dozen notifications flashing on the lock screen with her name attached. Carmen Bellamy. Bellamy Holdings. Urgent. Lien placed. My pulse quickened, but my stride never faltered. 9 minutes and counting. I slipped into the driver's seat of my car, doors locking behind me with a soft click that felt like the final seal on a contract I'd drawn up months ago. Through the tinted window, I watched the chaos unfold. Inside, someone, maybe Gia, had dropped her clutch by the stairs, and she'd been in painful-looking high heels to retrieve it. I was darting toward the door I just passed. Carmen's father, Richard Bellamy, ordinarily a pillar of calm authority, had turned in ash and gray. His suit jacket hung loose on his shoulders, as if the fabric itself couldn't bear the weight of what was happening. I saw Joan, her mother, fling her napkin across the table, silverware clattering against fine porcelain as she shouted something I couldn't catch. And somewhere in the background, a fork fell, and the sound felt like a gunshot. in the stunned silence. I started the engine and checked my watch. 1 a.m. Exactly the moment I programmed into Spectre Holdings' automated lean trigger. It wasn't a whim. It was a calculated move made possible by their own negligence. Months ago, when Carmen's father signed on a loan to finance Bellamy Holdings' expansion, he'd unknowingly leaned his personal assets as collateral. His lakeside mansion, the fleet of vintage sports cars, even the family trust vacation properties. All of it legally at Spectre's mercy. Inspector was me. When the first text arrived, estate liens initiated. Bellamy Mansion vehicles. I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. Another ping. House listed at county registry. I pressed play on the Bluetooth audio and heard Carmen's voice crack on her final toast echoing in my mind. It was poetic justice that the same night she toasted our divorce, her own empire would feel the cold sting of collapse. 2 minutes to go, I thought. 2 minutes until I held the key to her ruin. A cabbie flagged me down as I rolled up to a red light, but I wasn't about to explain myself, so I ignored him. Across the street, I watched as a dark SUV screeched into the valet area. Gia behind the wheel, clad in sequins and panic, barking orders to the valet attendants. She slapped her phone against her palm, red-faced, searching for any semblance of control. But there wasn't any tonight. Not for her, not for Carmen, and certainly not for her parents. I leaned back in my seat, hands casually draped on the steering wheel, and allowed the engine's hum to sink with the tiyar of adrenaline in my veins. At 30 seconds before the deadline, another notification lit my screen. All Bellamy vehicles transferred to Spectre Holdings. I hit the gas as the light turned green, gliding forward with smooth authority. By the time I pulled away from the curb, the cars were disappearing from the valet list. Rolls-Royces, Bentleys, even her beloved collection of restored Porsches gone. The attendants were left holding keys to empty driveways. I heard a shout behind me as Gia realized she was handing over a key that no longer unlocked anything. I flicked on the turn signal and merged into traffic, my car becoming a shield between me and their downfall. 7 minutes left until the mansion would follow. I drove through the city streets with purpose. Every curb and corner familiar. This route, this timing, had been mapped in my mind for weeks. I navigated past the Bellamy family's villa, an ornate stone mansion perched on a hill, its windows dark and silent under the moonlight. A single security guard paced the front gate, oblivious to the legal storm unfolding within his jurisdiction. I parked a half-block away and stepped out, phone in hand. The guard turned when I approached, hand hovering near his holster. But I raised my hand and showed him the county registry notification I'd just received. Bellamy Mansion, immediate transfer of title to Spectre Holdings. His eyes widened and he swallowed, nodding as he retreated toward the guardhouse. The gate's iron bars gleamed under floodlights, now owned by someone else. 3 minutes to go. I returned to my car, slipping into the driver's seat with the ease of a man long accustomed to operating behind the scenes. I opened my watch app, the countdown ticking down. 2 minutes and 15 seconds. A small smile played at the corners of my mouth. This was the payoff for every late-night writing code without recognition. Every boardroom appearance I'd been excluded from, every whispered insult from Joan about my lack of pedigree. They treated me like a footnote. Tonight, I became the headline. At 30 seconds, I pressed a button on my phone and triggered the automated listing. The property would hit the market. Assets liquidated at whatever price desperate buyers would pay. I watched as the confirmation came through. Bellamy Mansion listed public auction to commence at sunrise. And just like that, the foundation beneath Carmen's world cracked apart, sending shockwaves through her carefully curated existence. By the time I drove away, 9 minutes had turned into an eternity for her. Plenty of time to feel fear, regret, and the bitter taste of realization. I didn't stick around to watch them scramble for solutions. Instead, I slid back into my quiet routine, headed for a late-night coffee shop where I sip black coffee and let the night's cool air wash over me. I imagined the panic-fueled phone calls that would follow, the gate locks changed, the frantic texting between board members scrambling to salvage collateral. None of it mattered to me now. My part was done. I finished my coffee, paid the barista with a nod, and walked into the dark street. The city slept, or at least pretended to. But Bellamy Holdings wouldn't rest for years. Claims, lawsuits, emergency funding rounds, all orchestrated by a man they'd underestimated. As I disappeared into the night, one thought lingered. They built an empire on my hands. But they forgot one rule: never anger the architect. Tonight, their kingdom fell in 9 minutes flat, and I walked away unscathed, ready for the next move. They say timing is everything, and tonight I proved it. 1 hour. That's how much time I gave Carmen Bellamy's empire before it collapsed under its own hubris. When I handed her that envelope, I knew the real game was only just beginning. The champagne glasses and forced laughter at La Fontaine had been the opening act. The main event was a silent countdown ticking away in the bowels of Nova servers. As I slid into a booth at the Black Orchid, a dimly lit bar on the city's fringe, I placed my phone screen up on the table, dark until it wasn't. 60 minutes, flashing like a taunt. An hour ago, Nova's junior CTO, Braden Ellis, still thought he was in control. He'd inherited my responsibilities when I took a sabbatical, believing he could handle the system I built. He couldn't. Not without my biometric key. Most of Nova's clients wouldn't notice immediately back-end analytics stall for a few milliseconds here. A delayed report there, but the core trading algorithms, the live sales pipelines, the AI-driven fraud detection, everything hinged on that code I'd authored. I tapped the cradle of my coffee mug, leaning forward to watch the numbers crawl down on my phone. 55 minutes and 12 seconds. At Nova's headquarters, a sleek glass tower gleaming like a corporate crown, chaos was already brewing. I could almost hear the klaxon of internal alarms, the frantic typing, the muttered curses. Their systems began refusing access as soon as my protocol executed. Users locked out, servers set to maintenance, backup nodes disappearing in sequence. It was an elegant shutdown designed not to destroy data, just to make it utterly unreachable. Wipe the mirrored offshore backups, already done. Scrub any rollback points completed weeks ago when I noticed Carmen's increasing paranoia. This wasn't sabotage. It was authoritative reclamation. I poured a sip of bourbon, feeling the burn trail down my throat, and checked the timer again. 45 minutes and 27 seconds. With 45 minutes left, Nova's board would convene an emergency meeting. Phones blaring with inbound calls, they'd reach out to their investors. It took less than a day after Claudette's voice note for the fire in my chest to stop being a quiet burn and become something else entirely. Clarity. I had been quiet too long, too accommodating, too predictable. They weren't shocked that I canceled the trip. They were shocked that I did something that reminded them I could still make decisions without asking for their blessing. That realization was both sobering and electrifying. So I walked into my home office, sat down at my desk, and opened my financial dashboard. Everything Jasmine had ever tied to me, credit cards, recurring subscriptions, auto pay for beauty boxes, gym classes she rarely went to, those ridiculous bi-weekly ritual facials that cost more than my watch repair. I flagged them all, not in anger, but with surgical precision. No outburst, just a steady unraveling of convenience. I started with the gold AMX. She had 2 authorized cards under my account. One was used last week to buy a designer purse for the trip. The other for spa services she planned to share with her sister. I froze both cards with one click. Next, the Netflix account. the one I barely used anymore because every time I opened it, it had her family's profiles, Claude's Q, Morgan's faves, even one called Trevor Time. That one made me pause. I stared at the profile picture, an avatar with sunglasses and a stupid grin. I deleted it first, then the rest, then the entire account. I moved on to our joint cloud storage. Dozens of albums, most of them filled with pictures of Jasmine at events I wasn't invited to. Vacations, she said, were just girls' trips and dinners where I was the one taking the photo, not in it. I backed up what mattered to me, my work, old photos of us in the first few years, the one with my father before he passed, and cleared the rest. Then I called the bank and initiated a new account, one in my name only. Clean, private, no more shared pins, no more. Can you just transfer some money to cover this? By the time I was done, the silence in the apartment had shifted. It didn't feel lonely. It felt earned, like I had finally reclaimed something that was supposed to be mine all along. The next morning, I walked into a boutique travel agency downtown. The front desk smelled like citrus and teak wood, and the receptionist greeted me like I belonged there, which for the first time in a while, I actually felt like I did. "How can we help you today?" she asked, smiling with eyes that didn't scare me for status or invitation. "I'd like to book a solo trip," I said. "Portugal?" She blinked, then nodded with a kind of appreciation I didn't expect. "Any particular region?" "No," I said. "Surprise me." She raised her eyebrows, then grinned. "I like that." As she typed, I watched the screen reflect in the marble countertop. No +1, no family tabs, no group chat to coordinate with, just my name, my destination, my choice. She clicked confirm and a single boarding pass printed out on crisp white paper. I carried it back to my office and laid it on my desk right beside a wedding photo that had been there for years, the one where Jasmine wore ivory lace. And I stood beside her, beaming foolishly hopeful. I turned it face down, not out of spite, out of closure. I stared at the boarding pass again, my name printed alone, centered, clean. Marcus Hale, not Marcus and Guest, not Mr. Hale, spouse of Jasmine, just me. For years, I thought restraint was the higher path, that staying quiet made me strong, that enduring was a kind of nobility. I slid the boarding pass across my desk, watching the sunlight catch the embossed letters of my name, Marcus Hale, like a promise. No one else was on the itinerary. No co-pilot, no +1, not even a placeholder. Just me and an ocean of possibilities. A week earlier, I would have balked at the idea of traveling alone. I'd pictured myself perched at the edge of hotel pools, wondering if anyone cared that I was there. I would have agonized over whom to invite, what people might think, how to justify the expense. But now, as I touched the crisp paper, I realized I'd never traveled solo. Never made decisions based purely on what I wanted. I had always threaded my desires through the needle of someone else's expectations. I packed that evening. I folded shirts and trousers, slipped in a lightweight fleece, rolled socks and underwear with military precision habits from years of business trips. But this time, I added things I'd never packed before. A well-worn journal, a paperback novel I'd read in college, a small photograph of my father and me at Eagle Lake when I was 16. Things that mattered to me. I left the folder containing my canceled trip plans in the drawer. It served as a bookmark in my life. What I had been, what I chose to leave behind. I texted Carson, my assistant, and asked him to redirect any mail or packages here to my new account address. I told him to handle anything that looked like it involved Jasmine. No explanations needed. That night, I slept differently. No alarm set to catch an early flight. No restless half-sleep, wondering if I'd remembered everything. I dreamed of cobblestone streets and wind-blown cliffs, of tasting pastel di nata in a sunlit cafe courtyard, I woke up thinking of Porto, of hills dipped in terracotta, of bridges arcady. For once, I felt excited in a way I hadn't since university, before the wedding, before the endless obligations. The morning I flew out, I stood at the gate, passport and boarding pass in hand, and didn't feel a twinge of regret. Above me, the departure board glowed with destinations around the world. But I only read one: Lisbon. My heart threw myself grin at the thought of what awaited. Over the Atlantic, I opened my journal and wrote the first line. I am here. I am seen. I paused as the engine rumbled beneath me, then scrolled. This trip is mine. Writing those words felt like peeling off a mask I'd worn for years. I thought of Jasmine's text. He's more fun and fits the vibe better, and felt only curiosity, not bitterness. I was sad, certainly, but what I felt more strongly was relief. Relief that I didn't have to chase someone else's version of happiness. In Portugal, the air felt different. Salt and citrus laughter from street musicians winding through narrow alleys. The click of sneakers on weathered stone. I wandered without a map, stopping in pastelia after pastelaria for the flaky custard tarts. I chatted with the baker, the one who donned a bright blue apron, and learned the secret to perfecting the custard's silky center. I haggled with a ceramic shop owner over a hand-painted plate, something I would send to Carson as an apology for making him juggle my old life. I didn't care about looking foolish. I cared about feeling alive. One evening, I crossed the Domi Bridge at dusk. The sky was a gradient of orange and lavender, and I leaned over the metal railing, watching the river flow beneath me. A woman selling postcards offered me a glass of port. We toasted to strangers finding their way. I realized that in dissolving my old financial ties and canceling that cabin trip and freezing cards, I hadn't lost anything fundamental. I had shed everything that wasn't me. On the flight back, I revisited my journal. Pages of reflection of small triumphs, a conversation I led in a cafe, a hike along the Arab of foothills, a night spent reading by a harbor lantern. I wrote, I took my seat. No substitutes allowed. Every word echoed the lesson I'd learned back home. You build your own table, and you get to choose who sits with you. If no one cares to pull up a chair, you eat anyhow and taste freedom for the first time. When the wheels on the runway kissed the tarmac at JFK, I didn't dread re-entering my old world. I looked forward to it because I carried something back with me. A single boarding pass worth of courage and a name that belonged solely to me. I was no longer the quiet provider, the invisible supporting actor in someone else's drama. I was the lead in my story. I cleared customs, collected my single suitcase, and left the airport feeling rested in a way I never had after hotels and conferences. Marcus Hale had returned, and this time I was ready for whatever came next. Standing outside the terminal, I slipped the boarding pass into a small frame I carried in my bag, a keepsake of the journey, of the decision to be seen. I tapped the glass and smiled. I paid for everything I owned. I booked every trip I took, and I invited myself in. When Jasmine walked through the door 3 days after the canceled getaway, the echo of her suitcases hitting the hardwood floor sounded louder than any argument we'd ever had. I watched from the living room where the late afternoon light slanted through the blinds and fell in bands across the rug, painting the air gold and dust motes in slow motion. She stood in the entryway, shoulders hunched, voice wavering between anger and desperation. "You embarrassed me," she accused, each word sharp as a knife. In front of my entire family, her tone carried more hurt than I felt, and I realized in that moment that she believed her reputation was more fragile than our marriage. I let her have those words, let them hang in the air like smoke, because they revealed more about her priorities than any apology ever could. I didn't rush to soothe or explain. Instead, I rose from the sofa and crossed the room with deliberate calm. Carrying a simple white envelope sealed with a strip of red wax, she looked at me, eyes wide, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, searching for words that would somehow shift the balance of power back into her favor. I handed her the envelope without a word. The silence stretched until she tore the flap and pulled out its contents. A stack of crisp, unblemished receipts listing every cabin rental, activity fee, dining charge, and gift bag cost I had covered. A printed screenshot of her text to me is more fun and fits the vibe better, time-stamped and undeniable. And beneath them, a single handwritten note on my personalized stationery. You traded me for entertainment. Now pay your own bill. I watched as her face drained of color, the defiance in her eyes flickering into something that looked like guilt or fear. Her hands trembled as she sifted through the receipts again, tracing numbers in defeat. The weight of the paper in her lap felt heavier than any word I could speak. At last, she looked up, voice barely a whisper. Marcus. But she didn't finish, because the truth of what I'd given her sat between us. Unspoken, but crystal clear. I had been the one footing the cost of her curated life, and now I was asking her to bear it herself. She sank onto the edge of the sofa, the envelope still in her hands, and tears slipped down her cheeks. I could see in her reflection through the glass of my coffee table how small she had become, reduced from the woman who once ruled every room to someone trembling under the weight of her own actions. I felt a flicker of sympathy, because I knew what it was to be cornered by expectations. But sympathy turned to resolve when I remembered how easily she had cast me aside for a more entertaining prop. I took a slow breath and said, I'm not angry, Jasmine. I'm done. I invested in a partnership, not a performance. My words were simple, but they carried the heft of every dinner I'd cooked, every trip I'd planned, every moment I'd swallowed my pride to keep the peace. She looked at me, then really looked, and I saw something shift in her eyes, recognition that the man she married still existed beneath years of acquiescence, and that he would no longer be silent. She tried to speak again, this time with apology on her lips, but I shook my head. Don't, I said softly. Save it. And I meant it because I wanted her to understand that this moment, this confrontation, wasn't the start of anger or vengeance. It was the culmination of every unnoticed sacrifice. It was the moment when I recognized my own value. I turned and walked down the hallway to her bedroom. Jasmine's footsteps followed, light and hesitant, like a child trailing after her parent. I stopped at the doorway and looked back. She stood framed in the corridor light, eyes glistening. Marcus, please, she whispered, but I didn't step forward. I just shook my head and said, Your call. Then I walked inside, closed the door gently, and left her standing in the hallway, the envelope hanging limp in her hand, our lives forever divided by the paper I had placed between us. A week passed in an uneasy haze, days marked not by our calendar events, but by the tightening of my chest. Every time I thought of Jasmine's mother's voice note, every time my phone rang, and I wondered which member of her family was calling to demand answers, I maintained my routine. Early morning workouts, back-to-back client meetings, lunches at my desk. Yet, beneath the facade of normally, something shifted inside me. I no longer answered calls from unknown numbers, and I didn't open emails from Jasmine's account. Distance had become my ally. Then one morning, a crisp envelope arrived in my office mailbox. No return address, just my name printed in neat serif letters. I paused before opening it, watching the paper flutter under the fluorescent lights. Something about the weight of it told me this wasn't another invitation to family brunch or an apology text in physical form. I slid the envelope open, unfolded the letter inside, and my heart sank at the heading re-notice of claim for damages. It read like a twisted mirror of everything I had done to reclaim myself. Jasmine's lawyer detailed a laundry list of grievances: emotional distress caused by the canceled trip, reimbursement for lost family time, partial ownership of our condo, damages for reputational harm in her social circle. The language was clinical. Cold: we demand payment in full within 30 days. Failure to comply will result in further legal action, including liens against Mr. Hale's property. My name appeared again and again in that letter. Marcus Hale, framed not as a person, but as a defendant. I reread it twice to ensure I wasn't hallucinating. My stomach churned, a cocktail of disbelief and anger swirling inside me. They thought this was a game. They thought I would fold under pressure, pay the fees, and slink back into my designated role of provider. But I'd already walked away from that stage. I folded the letter, slid it back into its envelope, and stood with it in my hand, letting the gravity of their audacity sink in. At home that evening, I placed the letter on the kitchen island next to a bowl of fresh fruit and a stack of travel brochures for Portugal. I found Yara Knox's number in my contacts. My attorney, sharp-witted and unflinching, Yara answered on the second ring, as if she'd been waiting for this call. "Marcus, what's up?" She greeted, her voice steady. I took a deep breath. "I have a legal notice from Jasmine's lawyer. They're claiming damages for emotional distress and want half our condo. They want trip costs refunded and reimbursement for lost family time." A pause. Then Yara's characteristic chuckle, low and knowing. "They're really taking this route. I guess they think I'll blink." Yara sighed. "Let me see the letter. Email it over. And Marcus, they don't know who they're dealing with." Her confidence bolstered me. Within an hour, she had reviewed the letter and responded. "We'll file a countersuit for petition of assets and defend against these frivolous claims. Also, preserve your evidence. The original text message, travel confirmations, all receipts. And that screen recording of Jasmine's text you mentioned, you saved time-stamped. That will be undeniable evidence." I realized how essential it was. That screen recording I had made the moment the "he's more fun" text landed on my phone. I had done it on a whim. A protective habit developed after years of managing my own business and safeguarding contracts. At the time, I thought it practical. But now, it was a shield. I spent the next day gathering everything. I located the unedited screenshot of her text in my cloud storage, copied the timestamp, and printed it. I collected all the receipts for the cabin booking, activities, gift bags, every penny I'd spent. I printed the booking confirmations and cancellation emails showing the refunds issued. I opened my journal where I had noted the exact date and time of each cancellation. I exported the recording of the text message, clear audio, and video of Jasmine's initial message, complete with time and date overlays. That evening, I met Yara at her office, a sleek space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. She reviewed the documents, nodding approvingly as I handed them over. "This is airtight," she declared. "We'll file a formal financial partition petition and a motion to dismiss their claims. I'll draft the response tonight. They'll think twice before airing this in court." Hearing her say those words awakened a sense of vindication I hadn't felt in years. I realized I was no longer the invisible provider. I had legs to stand on. I had a voice. Most importantly, I had boundaries. On the drive home, I reflected on how this legal escalation mirrored the events that led here. Jasmine's family had always acted as though my contributions were limitless and unimportant. They assumed I would absorb every slight, every expense, every indignity, because that's what I always did. But this letter proved that even the most dependable person has a breaking point. A moment when they decide their worth is non-negotiable. Back at my apartment, I placed the assembled evidence into a folder embossed with my initials. I sat at my desk, turned on my laptop, and drafted an email to Yara. Send my response as soon as you can. I want this resolved before it spirals further. I hit send and leaned back, the adrenaline fading into a calm resolve. I thought of Jasmine's lawyer's demand for lost family time, a phrase so skewed it bordered on grotesque. They wanted to put a price on laughter in a cabin. They wanted to monetize memories I facilitated but never truly belonged to. I realized that the people who valued me only for what I provided could never comprehend my real price, dignity. Later that night, I opened the drawer where I kept my wedding photo, the one with Jasmine and lace and me and my tux. Smiling at a future that felt promising once upon a time. I flipped it face down, then placed the printed legal notice on top, covering that image completely. The photo remained there, hidden, but not erased. It was a reminder of where I had been and how far I'd come. I closed the drawer and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. A sense of anticipation filled me. Not the anxious kind, but the hopeful kind that comes when you chart your own course. The legal battle ahead wasn't just about money or condo. It was a declaration. I would protect myself. I would ensure that no one could mistake my silence for weakness again. And as the night deepened, I realized something profound. They thought this was a game, but I had become the player they never saw coming. 2 weeks had passed since I filed the financial partition and divorce intent. In that time, I'd weathered the storm of angry calls, pointed messages, and pressurized attempts at guilt. But the sharpest moment of all was the one I experienced alone in my office, when something, or rather, someone, finally spoke volumes without uttering a single word. It was late afternoon. My desk lamp cast a warm pool of light across the scattered documents, legal notices, bank statements, and that. But you chose betrayal. Now you have 2 options. Accept my terms or start rebuilding from scratch without Nova's core engineer. Carmen's face flushed red with anger and shame. You're extorting us, she hissed, stepping forward. This is blackmail. She raised her chin defiantly, yet her hands trembled. What will you do if we refuse? Her question hung in the air like a dare. I watched her, the flicker of a once confident leader reduced to a frightened spouse demanding mercy. I stood and walked around the desk, closing the distance between us. It's not blackmail, I said, voice low and controlled. It's a contract. You violated your vows, personal and professional. I'm simply enforcing the terms of partnership you abandoned. I paused near the window, looking out at the city skyline glittering under the night sky. Without me, Nova has no engine. Its trifecta of trading algorithms, AI analytics, and secure data pipelines are locked behind encryption keys only I possess. You can negotiate with me, or you can watch your company collapse in real time. Joan's composure cracked. She clutched her purse as if it might shield her from the consequences she'd ignored. Please, she whispered, voice trembling with fear. For the family's sake, Carmen. But Carmen cut her off with a sharp gesture, tears glinting in her eyes as reality sank in. I can't believe you do this, she said softly, voice breaking. She looked at me, a mixture of sorrow and resignation swirling in her gaze. We didn't realize how far you'd go. I remained silent, letting her regret echo through the room. My silence was a mirror reflecting all the times I'd watched her manage public relations while I fixed systems behind the scenes. Now, the roles were reversed. She was the one negotiating salvation. Richard exhaled, heavy with defeat. He seated himself in an armchair, head bowed. We accept your terms, he murmured, voice ragged. Jan sank onto the sofa, her posture crumpled. Carmen took a shaky step forward, extending her hand toward the portfolio on the desk. "We'll sign," she whispered, tears escaping despite her efforts. She lifted her head, meeting my eyes. "We," her voice caught. "We'll sign." I nodded and gestured for Maya to bring the documents forward. As she laid out each page, I watched Carmen and her parents sign, the sound of pen on paper like rivets sealing our new agreement. Each signature was a concession of power, each line acknowledging my worth. When the final document bore their marks, I stood, pocketed the signed copies, and looked at them with a sense of finality. "You have your deal?" I said softly. "Now leave." I waved toward the door, my tone both courteous and unwavering. Carmen hesitated, then walked past Maya, her shoulders squared despite the shame. Richard and Joan followed, their pride battered, but their survival intact. The door closed behind them, and silence reclaimed the suite. I exhaled, a slow release of tension I hadn't realized I'd held. This pact was more than a business agreement. It was my declaration of self-worth, my proof that power belonged to the one who held the key. As I sank into my chair, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. My terms are nothing, and they chose my terms. In the quiet aftermath, I poured a glass of whiskey and raised it to the empty doorway, to the empire that once stood on my shoulders, into the future I would architect on my own terms. Morning light filtered through the blackout curtains, painting the penthouse in pale gold. I woke to the soft hum of city traffic below, but the real stirrings were happening miles away, where Carmen Bellamy's empire teetered on the edge of a new reality. Beside me on the coffee table sat the signed documents, my trophy and their downfall neatly stacked and ready for filing. I poured a cup of strong black coffee, the aroma sharp enough to wake any lingering doubts. Today was the day I solidified power, turning their reluctant agreement into irreversible fact. The best part, they wouldn't know until the world told them. At precisely 9:30, I sent the first batch of filings to public registries and corporate counsel. Deeds transferred, liens released, IP assignments logged, every detail recorded in the public record. The digital clock on my desk flicked over to 9:31, and my inbox filled with confirmations, documents successfully filed, title transferred, patent assignment complete. Each message was a hammer strike, driving home the reality that Carmen's world had shifted irrevocably. I leaned back in my leather chair and took a long sip, savoring the knowledge that these actions couldn't be undone, not without legal chaos and public spectacle. When the press began to catch wind, Spectre Holdings acquires Bellamy Estate. Reyes Systems takes control of Nova Code. I watched the notifications appear on my screen. Journalists speculated on the details. How could a single co-founder outmaneuver an entire dynasty? Articles debated whether this was corporate genius or marital betrayal. I read each headline with detached interest, recognizing the narrative I had authored. No spin could erase the facts. Now my name stood at the forefront. I closed the laptop when the buzz reached a fever pitch, content that the world would now understand, what I had always known. By 11, my phone rang. It was my Lynn, her voice brisk. "All filings are live. Bellamy Holdings will be formally notified within the hour. Nova's board meeting has been called to emergency session." I responded with a calm affirmation and stood, stretching the tension from my shoulders. The adrenaline that fueled last night's showdown was ebbing, replaced by the quiet confidence of someone who had secured his future. I dressed in a crisp shirt and jacket. No need for designer labels now that I held the keys to an industry titan, and prepared to leave my sanctuary. The elevator ride down felt surreal. As the doors opened on the lobby, I passed the doorman who had greeted me for months. I offered a nod of acknowledgement. He returned a puzzled glance, unaware of the storm already unleashed. Outside, my car idled, driver waiting. I slipped into the back seat, watching the city blur as we glided toward Bellamy Holdings headquarters. I had no intention of facing Carmen or her parents again. I preferred to let the documents speak for themselves. But I wanted to be present when the first tremors of panic hit the boardroom windows. At Bellamy Towers, security recognized me, but hesitated, unsure whether to let me pass. I handed my business card to the guard, who called ahead. Within moments, I was escorted to the executive suite. No fanfare, just the steady click of shoes on marble and murmurs behind closed doors. Inside, Carmen's board of directors sat in stunned silence around a polished conference table. Their phones lay face up, screens glowing with emails titled Notice of Transfer and IP Assignment. When I entered, every head turned. Time seemed to stop as their eyes registered my calm presence. Carmen sat at the head of the table, posture rigid, her gaze distant. She refused to look at me directly, face drawn and pale. Richard and Joan flanked her, their expressions a mixture of anger, shame, and disbelief. I stepped forward, placing the sealed portfolio, the final public notice, on the table. "Good morning," I said evenly, voice carrying effortlessly across the room. "I trust you received the filings." Carmen's lips pressed into a thin line, and her mother sputtered. We weren't aware you'd file this publicly so soon." I opened the portfolio, revealing the documents with glossy seals and official stamps. "You agreed to my terms last night," I said, maintaining eye contact with each of them in turn. "These are the records. Their legal effect is immediate." The board chairman cleared his throat, voice shaken. "Mr. Reyes, we accepted." His words felt rehearsed, as though he'd repeated them in a mirror since dawn. I inclined my head. "Very well. I'll expect the settlement funds to be wired to Reyes Systems by close of business tomorrow. After that, I'll provide the biometric credentials to unlock Nova's core systems." With that, I turned and exited, senses tingling with victory. The click of the conference room door closing was the final chord in this symphony of power. Outside, I paused to inhale the crisp air carrying a faint scent of blooming jasmine from the building's landscape courtyard. The world beyond continued oblivious. Business deals, commuter chatter, life's mundane concerns. Yet inside those glass walls, a dynasty had been humbled and a new order established. I returned to my car and texted my Lynn. All complete. Collectible scheduled. Onto Raya's next steps. Her swift reply. "Understood. Congratulations," felt like a seal on our achievement. As the driver navigated back through the city, I let my mind wander to the future. Reyes Systems growth, partnerships waiting in the wings, a reputation forged in both brilliance and ruthlessness. Carmen Bellamy would live on in headlines, a cautionary tale in business schools. But I would be the architect behind the rise of a new empire, one built on respect, recognition, and the unshakable foundation of my own design. 3 days had passed since I sealed my victory over the Bellamy dynasty, and the world was still buzzing. My phone vibrated continuously, notifications from journalists, clients, even old colleagues reaching out with congratulations or curiosity. But the real moment of truth arrived when the interview request came in. Forbes. It was an email so succinct, yet loaded with weight. "We'd like to interview Reyes Systems founder on your role in Nova's transformation. Are you available?" I stared at the screen for a moment, savoring the irony. The same outlet that once wrote breathless profiles of Carmen Bellamy without ever mentioning me now wanted my story. I clicked yes and scheduled the call for the next morning. When the day arrived, I entered the Forbes studio, a minimalist space with wall-to-wall monitors displaying financial tickers, sleek desks, and chairs that looked more like art installations than seating. I wore a tailored navy suit, white shirt, black tie, understated, professional, nothing flashy. The last thing I needed was to distract from the message. A producer greeted me with a warm handshake and led me to a small green room where I reviewed talking points, my background, the origins of Nova, the strategic imperatives that led to reclaiming the code. I added a final note, emphasized collaboration over conflict, craftsmanship over ego. Because even in triumph, I wanted to shape the narrative. The host, Eliza Chan, was poised and articulate, the kind of journalist whose reputation for tough but fair questioning made viewers lean in. Once the cameras started rolling, she introduced me as the Ghost co-founder turned corporate architect and nodded for me to begin. I leaned forward slightly, meeting her gaze. "Thank you, Eliza. It's a pleasure to be here." She launched right in. "Reyes, your story reads like a business thriller. You helped build Nova headquarters to Fortune 500 backbone, only to lock them out in a hostile takeover after a failed marriage. How do you reconcile personal motivations with professional ethics?" I smiled, understanding the trap. My actions were entirely professional. I began choosing my words carefully. I spent 8 years crafting Nova's architecture, developing its trading algorithms, AI analytics, and security systems. When negotiations with the Bellamy family broke down, it became clear that my contributions were undervalued and my role marginalized. I set up a legal framework that compelled recognition and fair compensation, not for revenge, but as a matter of principle. I paused, letting the studio's hush underscore my next point. Ethics in business is about honoring agreements and valuing expertise. I simply ensured both were respected. Eliza raised an eyebrow. Her next question pointed, "Some critics call your approach extortion. They argue that locking an entire company out of its own systems endangered jobs and client data. What's your response?" I leaned back, folding my hands. "I find the description misleading. At no point did I compromise data integrity or client assets. My protocol was a lockout, not a destruction. I froze access, compelling the Bellamy family to negotiate in good faith. It's akin to withholding your signature on a contract. You don't destroy the deal. You pause it until terms are agreed upon." I gave a small nod. "And as for jobs, the dispute resolved in less than a week, with no layoffs or data breaches. Everyone got paid, and operations resumed under clear, fair conditions." She tapped her notes. "Let's talk about legacy. The Bellamy name is synonymous with corporate prestige. How do you see your legacy compared to theirs?" This was where I let a touch of humility in. Legacy isn't built on name recognition, but on tangible contributions. The Bellamys brought capital and vision. I provided the engine and the code. Without that engine, vision remains an idea. Legacy is about what you leave behind. Functional systems, successful clients, and an environment where expertise is valued. I plan to build RISE systems with those principles at its core. Eliza nodded thoughtfully. Looking ahead, what's next for Reyes Systems? Do you harbor any plans to revisit Nova, or is this a firm break? I smiled, sensing an opportunity to expand on my future. Reyes Systems is rooted in partnerships. We already have 10 Fortune 500 clients using our proprietary frameworks. My goal is to scale our consultancy and proprietary software offerings, focusing on transparency and collaboration. As for Nova, I'm open to collaboration on terms that appreciate my expertise, but it will be a partnership, not a hierarchy. She leaned forward, wrapping up the main segment. In closing, what advice would you give to professionals who feel undervalued in their organizations? I considered for a moment. Know your worth and document your contributions. Build legal and professional frameworks that recognize your expertise, whether it's patents, equity agreements, or formal partnership contracts. And never underestimate the power of your skills. If you're essential, you have leverage. Use it wisely and always aim for fair recognition rather than personal vendettas. The cameras cut and Eliza smiled warmly. Thank you, Reyes. That was insightful. I stood shaking her hand. Behind the scenes, producers congratulated me. Small smiles, impressed nods. I left the studio with a sense of closure and renewed momentum. My story was now in print, online, and broadcast across business networks. The public would read about a calculated, ethical architect who turned a personal fallout into a corporate president. Back in my office, I checked the Forbes site. The architect of collapse, how Reyes reclaimed his share of Nova, complete with a photo of me standing against the city skyline. Comments poured in, industry leaders praising my stance, entrepreneurs debating my methods, and even some tech forums speculating on the legal ramifications. I clicked through a few, nodding at the analysis. They called me a maverick, a renegade, a visionary. I was all of those things. But most importantly, I was recognized. That afternoon, I convened a meeting with my executive team. Lead engineers, legal advisors, marketing strategists. We reviewed the interview's impact, drafted press releases, and planned outreach to potential partners. Our phone lines lit up with inquiries. Fortune 100 companies seeking system audits, venture capitalists exploring investment, and strategic partners eager to integrate our solutions. The buzz was real, and I felt the familiar thrill of building something new. As evening fell, I found a quiet moment on the rooftop terrace of my penthouse. The city lights sprawled beneath me, each flicker a reminder of the lives touched by technology. I raised a glass of single malt whiskey to the night sky and whispered a silent toast to the journey from that cramped co-working space to commanding boardrooms and media stages. The man they forgot to fear had become the man they couldn't ignore. The world had changed its narrative about me in 9 minutes, 1 hour, 6 days, and 900 seconds. Now, after 3 days and 1 landmark interview, it knew the truth. I was the architect, the guardian of systems, and the master of my own destiny. And this was only the beginning. They said I would fade into obscurity once my story played out. But I'm still here, stronger, sharper, and with a clearer vision than ever. The fallout from Nova's collapse transformed into an empire's blueprint, and every headline calling me the architect of collapse felt like a badge of honor. Now, as I stand in my newly renovated headquarters, walls lined with patents and framed contracts, I reflect on the lessons learned from Carmen Bellamy's downfall. This morning, I walked into a conference room filled with my team of engineers and strategists. Their faces lit up at the sight of me, not merely as a quiet coder, but as the leader who reclaimed his worth. We reviewed client pipelines and inked partnerships that would have been impossible under Nova's old regime. I listened to their ideas, guided our roadmap, and felt the hum of collaboration, something I had missed during those years behind the scenes. Later, I took a moment alone to draft a letter to Carmen's parents, outlining the agreed terms for goodwill and future collaboration. Despite their rejection of me as an equal, I believe in the power of reconciliation. Power without grace is empty. Both heritage and innovation can coexist when there's mutual respect. At dusk, I stepped onto the roof terrace to watch the skyline blush under the setting sun. The city whispered of opportunities yet to be seized. I raised my glass and whispered a promise to myself. This is only the beginning. Nova may have been built on my shoulders, but Reyes Systems will stand on its own merits. They won't forget the man who taught them to fear the unseen force driving their success. Every protocol, every line of code carries my legacy forward. Proof that true power lies in intellect, integrity, and unwavering conviction always.